There are moments in television when a discussion becomes bigger than the people sitting around the table. And then there are moments when someone says something that forces you to look beyond the headlines, beyond the royal gossip, beyond the endless arguments about who said what to whom. And suddenly you are no longer talking about Meghan Markle. You are talking about Britain. You are talking about race. You are talking about tradition. You are talking about who gets accepted, who gets questioned, who gets forgiven, and who gets placed permanently under a microscope. And that is exactly why this discussion involving Ayesha Hazarika and Piers Morgan remains so fascinating. Because while the conversation was supposedly about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the deeper issue was something much bigger. It was about the uncomfortable collision between an ancient institution and a modern society. It was about what happens when someone enters a world that has historically been defined by tradition, uniformity, and expectation, and refuses to disappear quietly into the background. And Sussex gang, this is where I want us to really think. Because perhaps the biggest question is not, why did Meghan leave? Perhaps the bigger question is, and once you start asking that question, the entire story begins to look very different. Before we go any further, I want you to listen carefully to this moment from the discussion.
And the fact that she is being held largely responsible for all of this.
Well, I'm pretty depressed about the coverage. I mean, when it was announced that she was joining the royal family, the engagement, I have to say, I was over the moon. I felt really, really hopeful about the symbol that this sent to the world, about what this kind of country this was. I thought it was a great... Well, look, these were two people in love. It's not like a Benetton advert, but it did show a sign of sort of modernity, that you had somebody from a very different background, a woman who's biracial, of colour, black mother, coming into the royal family. And I know, growing up myself, my parents are Indian, I'm from a Muslim background. I grew up in a pretty tough part in the outskirts of Glasgow. I remember growing up in the 1970s, particularly in the 1980s, and there was a lot of racism around. What was the kind of phrase, you know, there ain't no black in the Union Jack was the sort of thing. There's a lot of people who felt that we shouldn't have black blood mingling with blue blood of the royal family. So I think it was a kind of a great symbol. And then I have to say, after the wedding and the honeymoon period was over, I was quite dismayed, actually, at the way that the coverage went. I mean, she got quite a lot of grief in the run-up. In fact, the royal family had to say, look, back off a wee bit in terms of some of the way she was portrayed.
Well, Prince Harry complained.
Yeah, and look, I just think...
Well, she disowned her father.
That is nothing to do with the kind of coverage that she got. So let's just...
Hang on a minute. That's exactly why the coverage turned negative.
Look at how she is
nothing
compared.
Nothing to do with racism. Where has been the racism?
Let's look at the way she has been compared to, let's say, Kate. So I'm going to give you 3 examples.
This is
pointless
what you're about to do.
You're
about to take 3...
Well, hang on. Ayesha put her on before you dismantle it.
You invited me onto the show.
Off you go.
I took up the challenge.
Absolutely
Come
right.
on, show some manners. This was cradled. You know, Kate cradles her bump. Everyone's like, oh, it's a lovely, warm, maternal thing. Meghan cradles her bump. It's like, ooh, look at the way she's cradling her bump.
Meghan genuinely cradled her bump in a weirder way than Kate.
That's
a fact.
It's
a tiny, little, insignificant thing. But every mother I've talked to said the same thing.
No,
every mother, black, white, gender fluid,
hello.
any mother you like,
Piers, hello.
said the same thing.
I'm a mother.
Well, you don't see anything wrong with her.
I do not agree with your characterisation of the way that
Aisha,
you may self-identify as a penguin these days, Piers, but you have not been pregnant.
Penguin.
OK, let me now respond.
You might look like you are, but you're not pregnant.
Wow.
Now, let us unpack what we just heard. Because Ayesha Hazarika's argument was not simply that Meghan Markle is perfect. That is an important distinction. Defending someone against disproportionate criticism does not mean claiming that person has never made a mistake. Those are 2 completely different things. And yet, somehow, whenever Meghan's supporters raise questions about the media treatment she received, the conversation is immediately dragged into a completely different territory. We're told, but what about this? But what about that? But what about her family? But what about the staff? But what about the interviews? But what about the Oprah conversation? And suddenly the question of media bias disappears. But let's stop there. Because even if you believe Meghan handled certain situations badly and people are entitled to their opinions, does that automatically explain the scale and intensity of the hostility directed at her? Does it explain why every facial expression became a headline? Why every outfit became a controversy? Why every public appearance became a referendum? Why her ambitions were interpreted as arrogance, while similar ambition in others was often described as confidence? And why, in some corners of the media, did the story seem to become less about what Meghan actually did, and more about what people had already decided she represented? That is the question Ayesha Hazarika was pushing us toward. And it is a question that deserves an honest answer. Because Meghan Markle did not simply walk into the royal family. She walked into a global institution at a moment when the world was changing. A biracial American woman was entering one of the most famous families on earth. For many people, that was not just a wedding. It was symbolic. It represented the possibility that the monarchy could evolve, that an institution built over centuries could reflect the society around it, that the image of British royalty could become more representative of modern Britain. And let's be honest, that was always going to be a complicated moment, because change sounds wonderful in theory. But when change actually arrives at your doorstep, suddenly people discover that they preferred the idea of change more than the reality of it. And this is where Meghan's story becomes so fascinating. Because the woman who was once celebrated as evidence of a modern monarchy quickly became one of the most intensely scrutinised women in the British press. And that contrast is impossible to ignore. One minute, the message was, "Look how modern the monarchy is." The next minute, it seemed to be, "Look how much we dislike the person who represents that modernisation." And Sussex gang, this is where I want to challenge the narrative. Because we have to ask ourselves, or was she also being judged as a symbol of change, a symbol of multicultural Britain, a symbol of an institution moving into unfamiliar territory, and perhaps for some people, a symbol of a future they were not emotionally prepared to accept. Now, Ayesha also raised another important point, the contrast in media treatment. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because if you compare the way different royal women have been portrayed over the years, you can see enormous differences in language. One woman can be described as elegant. Another is called calculated. One is praised for ambition. Another is accused of chasing publicity. One is described as confident. Another is labelled attention-seeking. One is seen as fashionable. Another is accused of vanity. And sometimes the facts are not dramatically different. The difference is in the framing. And framing matters. Because the media does not simply tell us what happened, it often tells us how we are supposed to feel about what happened. And if a woman is repeatedly presented as difficult, demanding, manipulative, or unlikable, eventually the public begins to consume that narrative as though it were an established fact. That is the power of repetition. And Meghan experienced an extraordinary amount of it. But here's where I want to go even deeper. Because the question of race cannot simply be reduced to whether every journalist consciously intended to be racist. That is too simplistic. The more complicated question is whether unconscious bias, cultural assumptions, and institutional habits can influence how someone is perceived. And the answer to that question is clearly yes. It happens everywhere. It happens in workplaces, it happens in schools, it happens in politics, it happens in entertainment, and it can happen in journalism. So, when Ayesha Hazarika raises the issue of race, she is asking audiences to consider something uncomfortable. Could race have influenced the way Meghan was perceived, even when individual people believed they were simply reporting the news? That is a conversation worth having. And it does not require us to pretend Meghan is beyond criticism. In fact, the opposite is true. A mature conversation allows both things to exist at the same time. Meghan can be criticised, and Meghan can also be subjected to unfair treatment. Both can be true. But what we cannot do is use every criticism of Meghan as proof that racism is impossible. That is not how bias works. And here's another point that I think deserves far more attention: the breakdown of relationships. This has become one of the central weapons used against Meghan. Family members, friends, former colleagues, people from her past, every relationship that ended became evidence in the prosecution of Meghan Markle. But let's be honest, how many people listening to me right now have experienced a friendship that ended? How many have fallen out with a relative? How many have grown apart from someone they once loved? How many relationships in your own life are no longer what they once were? Probably many. Because that is life. People change, circumstances change, priorities change, and sometimes relationships end. But when it comes to Meghan, every broken relationship is treated as though it reveals a permanent character defect, and that is where the conversation becomes unfair. Because the existence of conflict does not automatically tell us who is right. It simply tells us that there was conflict. And yet, Meghan's personal relationships have repeatedly been presented as evidence that she deserves public condemnation. But here's the question: where is the proportionality? Even if Meghan has made mistakes in her relationships, why should that justify years of relentless public hostility? Why should it justify a permanent media campaign against her? Why should millions of people feel entitled to dissect every aspect of her character? And why should the mistakes of one person become entertainment for an entire industry? This is where I believe Ayesha's argument cuts through the noise. She is essentially asking us to separate ordinary human imperfection from extraordinary public punishment, because those are not the same thing. Now, let's talk about something else that has always fascinated me: Meghan's voice. Because apparently, when members of the royal family speak about important issues, that is leadership. But when Meghan speaks, suddenly the question becomes, who does she think she is? Climate change, gender equality, mental health, social justice, community issues. These topics are not new to the royal family. Members of the monarchy have spoken about public issues for decades, and yet Meghan's advocacy has often been treated differently. Why? Is it because she is a woman? Is it because she is American? Is it because she is biracial? Is it because she was not born into the institution? Or is it because she challenged the idea that her role was simply to smile, wave, and remain silent? Perhaps the answer is a combination of all these things, because Meghan did something that was always going to be disruptive. She arrived with a voice, and she was not afraid to use it. And let's be clear, that does not mean every statement she has made must be agreed with. It simply means she has the same basic right as anyone else to express her views. And if another royal can speak passionately about environmental issues without being accused of having an agenda, why should Meghan automatically be treated as though her advocacy is somehow suspicious? This is where consistency matters. You cannot demand that Meghan be judged by one standard while everyone else is judged by another. That is not fairness. That is a double standard. And perhaps the most revealing part of this entire debate is what happened after Harry and Meghan decided to step away. Because if the problem was simply that Meghan had not adapted to royal life, surely leaving should have ended the controversy. But it didn't. In fact, in many ways, the scrutiny intensified. They left. They moved to America. They built a new life. They launched projects. They spoke publicly. And still, the conversation continued. This tells us something important. Perhaps the real conflict was never simply about royal duties. Perhaps it was about control. The institution had a certain expectation of what royal life should look like. Harry and Meghan chose a different path, and that decision challenged the traditional narrative. Because if someone can leave the institution and still build a meaningful life, then the institution no longer has complete control over the story. And that is powerful. Harry and Meghan's decision forced the world to consider an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe there is life after the palace. Maybe you can walk away. Maybe you can redefine yourself. Maybe you can build something different. And perhaps that is why their story remains so polarizing. Because it is no longer simply a royal story. It is a story about independence. It is a story about identity. It is a story about choosing your own path. And it is a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept the role that other people have written for them. Now, I want to return to that discussion one final time. Because when you listen to the arguments surrounding Meghan, you begin to notice something. The loudest critics often want us to believe that the entire controversy is about Meghan's personality. But the deeper conversation is about something much larger. It is about race, it is about gender, it is about class, it is about tradition, it is about media power, and it is about the fear that sometimes accompanies change. Because Meghan's presence forced the monarchy to confront a question it could no longer avoid. What does a modern monarchy actually look like? And perhaps the reason this conversation became so explosive is that there was no easy answer. The institution could celebrate diversity, but could it fully embrace the consequences of diversity? Could it welcome someone different without demanding that they become exactly the same? Could it accept a woman with her own identity, her own career, her own opinions, and her own voice? Those are much harder questions, and perhaps that is why this story continues to matter. Now, Sussex gang, I want to leave you with this. You do not have to believe that Meghan is perfect to believe that she deserves fairness. You do not have to agree with every decision Harry and Meghan have made to believe they have the right to make those decisions. And you certainly do not have to accept every narrative presented by the British media as unquestionable truth. Because at the end of the day, the media is powerful, but it is not infallible. Commentators are powerful, but they are not judges. And headlines are powerful, but they are not facts. The truth requires us to look deeper. And sometimes the truth is not found in the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it is found in the question that nobody wants to answer. And perhaps the question we should all be asking is this. If Meghan Markle had been treated exactly like every other royal woman, would her story have unfolded differently? We may never know the answer with absolute certainty. But we can examine the patterns. We can compare the coverage. We can challenge the double standards. And we can have honest conversations about race without turning every discussion into a political battlefield. Because this is not about demanding that everyone love Meghan Markle. It is about demanding that everyone judge her fairly. And that is a very different thing. The truth, Sussex gang, does not need to scream. It simply needs to be examined. And when you look closely at the story of Harry and Meghan, you begin to realize that perhaps the biggest controversy was never that they wanted to destroy the monarchy. Perhaps the real controversy was that they dared to imagine a life beyond it. A life where they could speak, a life where they could choose, a life where they could build, and most importantly, a life where they could decide for themselves who they wanted to become. And maybe, just maybe, that is why their story continues to provoke such powerful reactions. Because Harry and Meghan did not simply walk away from a system. They challenged the assumption that the system had the final word. And that is a story worth discussing. So, Sussex gang, I want to hear from you. Do you believe Ayesha Hazarika was right to raise the issue of racial bias in the way Meghan has been portrayed? Do you think the media has applied a different standard to Meghan compared with other members of the royal family? Or do you believe the criticism she received was justified? Let us have that conversation respectfully in the comments. And if you believe this discussion deserves to be heard beyond the usual headlines, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, and share this video with someone who wants to look beyond the surface. Because here, we don't just repeat the headlines. We question them, we examine them, and sometimes we pull them apart. Until next time, Sussex gang. Stay informed, stay discerning, and never be afraid to ask the question that everyone else is too afraid to ask. Because sometimes, when the truth finally rains down,